All right, and welcome back to 9.1. In the last podcast, we were outlining different polyatomic ions. We talked about using oxygens to turn the IDE into 8s. So we talked about chlorate, nitrate, carbonate, sulfate, phosphate, bromate, iodate, etc. We talked about if you remove an oxygen, it turns the 8 into an ite in the terms of chlorite, nitrate, sulfite, phosphite. If you remove additional oxygens, you add the hypo prefix, so you have hypochlorite, hypobromite, hypoiodite. Or if you add oxygens above the 8, you can give it a prefix of per, as in perchlorate, perbromate, periodate. And we also introduced the idea, if I scroll back up here, of peroxide and permanganate. What I also want to introduce to you the idea of is adding hydrogens to some of these. And so if I scroll down here, you have carbonate, which was CO3 2-. However, when you add a hydrogen, the hydrogen carries a positive charge, so the 2- becomes a 1-. And we simply call this hydrogen carbonate. If you add a hydrogen, just stick hydrogen in front of the polyatomic ion name. Although normally we don't actually call this hydrogen carbonate, the old way of naming this, which is still very common, is bicarbonate. The prefix bi denotes the fact that you've added hydrogen to the carbonate ion. Similarly, if you have HSO4, SO4 is sulfate, SO4 2-. If you have HSO4, it is now a 1-. You've added a hydrogen, which have added a positive charge. If it was a 2-, you're down to a 1-, and we would call this hydrogen sulfate. Or you could also call this bisulfate. All right. You could do the same with sulfite. SO3 2-, but when you add a hydrogen with that positive charge, the charge goes down to a 1-, and we would call this hydrogen sulfite. Or bisulfite. Excuse me. All right, scrolling down. Dealing with the phosphates, we have PO4, which is a 3- charge. That's the phosphate ion. If I add a hydrogen, it is now down to a 2- charge. It was a 3-. Scroll up and you can see. Now you're down to 2-. We call this hydrogen phosphate. And in fact, we can add one more hydrogen and it'll still have a charge. So if it was a 2-, adding one more hydrogen will now give this a 1- charge, and we call this dihydrogen phosphate. Dihydrogen simply meaning two hydrogens with a phosphate ion, and the two hydrogens carry two extra positive charges, so you went from a 3- all the way down to a 1-, comparing it to the phosphate ion. So those are also polyatomic ions that are on the list that you can use on your quiz and on your test. Now, when I say that you can use it on your quiz and your test, we're not talking about the polyatomic ions quiz itself. You will have to take a polyatomic ions quiz where you're trying to learn these guys. You cannot use the list on the quiz. That would defeat the purpose of the quiz. I want you to learn it for the quiz, and then you can use your list when you're actually taking the test, when you're trying to name compounds. Now, there is one more polyatomic, actually two more, that I want to share with you. CrO4 2- is what we call chromate. If you double it, we call it dichromate. Doubling it simply means you have Cr2O. Now you might think it's an 8, it's actually O7, so it's almost doubling it, but it's still called dichromate. It is Cr2O7 2-. Okay, so in summary, here's how it's best to learn these things. If you learn your 8s, chlorate, nitrate, carbonate, sulfate, phosphate, bromate, iodate. You can then work off from that. One less oxygen is the ites, two less oxygen is hypoite, one more oxygen is per-ate, and then you can start adding hydrogens to them. Carbonate becomes hydrogen carbonate or bicarbonate, similarly with the sulfate and the phosphates. And with the chromate, you can actually double it to form dichromate. Once you learn those, looking at that list of polyatomic ions and using that on your test will become much, much easier than trying to use it without actually trying to learn the polyatomic ions. Okay? That concludes 9.1.